the Great British Manufacturing Podcast, brought to you by MTD, MFG and Jefferson.
Hello and welcome to this week's Great British Manufacturing Podcast. On this week's show, we will review the latest positive news from the British manufacturing sector, and we will welcome a special guest, Fhaheen Khan, Senior Economist at Make UK. We've also got positive UK manufacturing news from the likes of Nissan, Haribo, JLR, and many, many more. But just before we start with the positive news, I'd like to welcome two businesses to the Factory Now platform. Factory Now is a platform where manufacturers can collaborate, they can boost sales, they can look to reshore. And new members this week include MRP Easy, a cloud-based manufacturing ERP system specifically for small manufacturers, as well as Kent-based Shape Metal Specialist Contracts Engineering. For more information on this platform, please contact inquiries at mtdmfg.com to discuss joining the platform. I'm Joe Reynolds, and this week I'm joined by my co-host, Stuart Whitehead. Stuart, let's jump straight in. The new Qashqai has entered production at the Sunderland plant. We covered this a while ago, but now the car is in production.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, following a £400 million investment, the latest version of the crossover is now rolling off the plant to production line 1 as the factory celebrates 35 years of manufacturing in the UK. More than 3.5 million Sunderland-built Qashqais have been sold since its launch in 2007. And to celebrate this new generation model, the car maker is offering every skilled child in the North East the opportunity to take part in a Nissan Skills Foundation event, the company's programme of activities designed to promote careers in manufacturing and engineering. Designed, engineered and built in Britain, the Qashqai supports more than 7,000 direct jobs, would you believe, and a further 24,000 across the UK supply chain.
It's fantastic, isn't it? All around the supply chain, the jobs and what they're doing with STEM engagement. You know, that's pioneering. More should follow.
Absolutely. It's fantastic what they're doing.
Yeah, and Haribo, they're investing 22 million into their new West Yorkshire site. My kids love these sweets, and looking at the investment, they're not alone.
No, I think we all do. So German-owned confectionery manufacturer states strategic investment demonstrates the firm's commitment to the UK and will be rolled out throughout this year. It will deliver additional capacity, greater efficiencies and reduce costs at the site, which produces 30,000 tonnes of sweets each year. So plenty for your kids there, Joe. The investment will also look to ensure the manufacturer maintains its market-leading position in the UK by meeting changing consumer habits, by supporting the reformulation of products, reducing sugar and creating treats that deliver greater choice to retailers and shoppers.
Jaguar Land Rover, they're developing a hydrogen-powered prototype vehicle. This is an interesting development. We talk a lot about electrification, but obviously JLR edging their bets, looking at hydrogen also.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are seeing other firms looking at hydrogen, as you say. So based on the new Defender model, Britain's biggest car maker is developing a prototype hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle, FCEV for short, with testing scheduled to begin this year. The concept car is part of JLR's aim to achieve zero tailpipe emissions by 2036 and net zero carbon emissions across its supply chain products and operations by 2039. Project, known as Project Zeus, is part funded by the government-backed Advanced Propulsion Centre and will allow engineers to understand how a hydrogen powertrain can be optimised to deliver the performance and capability expected by its customers.
Yeah, we'll take a break there, Stuart, as I'd like to introduce this week's very special guest, Fhaheen Khan, Senior Economist at Make UK. Fhaheen, a very warm welcome to today's podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yep, just to start, can you tell us a little bit about your career to date and also an introduction to Make UK?
Yeah, just to start off with myself. So I'm one of the senior economists, as you mentioned, at Make UK. I work within the policy team. Before this, I was actually still a graduate doing my master's in school. I spent some time as an economic consultant for about 6 months, and this is my first job, essentially, since finishing, and it's been an interesting journey. For those of you who don't know, Make UK are the leading UK Manufacturers Trade Association. We are support and champion the manufacturing sector where enable in skills, in finance, in policy. My role is dictated towards policy. Our objective is to ensure that all government policy, regulations, legislations, anything that might impact manufacturers are designed in the most appropriate way so that it allows the sector to prosper and grow.
So what does that mean on a daily basis? What do you do on a daily basis in terms of your role and responsibilities?
Yeah. So on a daily, I suppose my primary purpose is to produce economic reports. One of those, which we will talk about later on, is the manufacturing outlook, which tries to understand the kind of the quarterly performance of manufacturers. And we use that data to actually influence government to show them how manufacturers, when they're struggling, when they're doing well, and what sort of what sort of policies that we should either enact or at least adapt existing policies in order to best support that sector. But on the side, we also look at policy, commissioned reports that try to understand the kind of microeconomic level. So, for example, looking at the regional impact of different policies, trying to understand how manufacturing in the West Midlands might be different to the Northeast or the Northwest, really to ensure that the support is not necessarily uniform, but actually tries to understand that manufacturing as an industry is incredibly diverse. And my day-to-day can go from anything from producing these reports that tries to understand those differences to producing comments on such as, let's say, the PMI that comes out on a monthly basis to try and understand what actually the PMI's figures would mean for the manufacturers in the UK. And it's quite variable. It's not exactly what you'd expect an economist to do in other industries, but it is quite an interesting role that I have here.
Morning, Fhaheen. Thanks for joining us this morning. As you mentioned earlier, we're here specifically today to talk about the Manufacturing Outlook report. So first question, what is it?
Yeah. So the Manufacturing Outlook report, it is a survey that's been conducted for about just over 30 years now. It essentially looks at the performance of manufacturers using 5 or 6 various metrics on a quarterly basis, asking our members, so we direct this survey to our members, whether they have seen an increase or decrease or no change in a particular metric in the last 3 months. To give you an example of that, the indicators that we track include output, orders, employment, and investment intentions, which is actually a more forward-looking indicator. And for the last 8 years or so, we've also been tracking levels of average confidence in your business and the UK economy. It's an interesting survey, but it is also worth understanding how to represent that data. So we report the figures as balances of change. So we look at those who say that they have seen an improvement in, let's say, output versus those that have seen a decrease in output. And we try to get an understanding of what the general direction that sector has moved in the last quarter. So it's a very good tracker of understanding what direction that sector is going, but not necessarily a tracker of the magnitudes of change.
And just on the mechanics of that, is it weighted then? So if you're a larger manufacturer reporting positive news compared to a smaller SME reporting negative news, for example, do you take that into consideration?
We do take that into consideration. The data itself is not weighted, but we do break down the data via employment band groupings and turnover bands, trying to understand how does the average figures actually differ if you were to break down the survey sample to just SMEs only, which would be under 250 employees or below 25 million in turnover for our definitions, and how do the figures differ for large firms if they were above the 25 million figure or above the 250 employment band size. So we do look at that, but we don't weight the actual average headline figures to account for that.
Thanks for clarifying that. And the Quarter 2 survey has been published this week in partnership with BDO. What does it tell us about the state of the sector?
So this has been a very interesting survey for us. I mean, of course, we've just been in a pandemic, and what we have found is that manufacturers have essentially outperformed their expectations. So I should have mentioned just a moment ago that not only do we track what manufacturers have performed in the last 3 months, but we also ask them what they think they will achieve in the next 3 months, just to give a bit of an outlook on what the next quarter looks like. Manufacturers have had a pretty difficult year. I mean, they faced almost a triple threat of disasters. Many of those are still ongoing. We could say the TCA, which is following the UK's exit from the European Union, the COVID-19 pandemic, and also more recently supply chain disruptions. But despite all that, manufacturers outperformed their expectations. They reported a balance of 36% on output, which is the highest that we have ever recorded on our survey history. In words, what does that actually mean? It just means that it's the largest share of manufacturers ever recorded that have experienced an improvement in output in the last 3 months relative to those that have reported a decrease. And we can see that sort of, indicator being reported across the board, particularly on the orders levels, which is actually the second highest figure at 34%. The domestic market for UK orders has come up at 27%. These all can be described in a very similar way. It's the weighting towards those who have improved versus those who have actually worsened. The improvement essentially dominates the sector. And I guess what has surprised us about these surveys and these very overly robust figures is that we were always expecting some sort of pent-up demand to take shape eventually in manufacturing. If you suppress a sector artificially, eventually it's going to rebound at some point. And we were always expecting this was going to happen later down the line, maybe 6 months on from now. And it caught us off guard a little bit how early that's come. The indicators suggest that bounce back has started much, much earlier than previous. And what we can take away from that is just how resilient the manufacturing sector is. Even during a crisis, we expect a sector like manufacturing to be pretty vulnerable, but that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems that many have actually learned. You could go into the reasons why we think that they were able to be so resilient, why they were able to bounce back quicker. And I think it's partly down to the difference in how the sectors had to deal with the pandemic in comparison to other sectors. Manufacturing as an industry was not required to shut down. So they had to actually learn from the pandemic in a different way. They had to learn how to operate in factories using under social restrictions. And that has enabled the sector to be more prepared. Even if lockdowns were to be reenacted, it didn't affect the manufacturing sector as much as it would, let's say, hospitality. And the mood has certainly changed from doom and gloom to a sense of real possibilities and opportunities. But we would say that there is an essence of caution to be had with these figures, is that the sector did lose about 10% of its sector value during the year of 2020, which equates to about £18 billion in GVA, gross value added. And at the moment, the sector is still behind where it was pre-pandemic. So it's still catching up, and this doesn't necessarily mean new growth, but it is a good indicator that we're going to go back to where we were sooner than expected. And just to kind of finish up, we have revised our forecast for manufacturing output levels for the year 2021. We expect them to grow by about 7.8%. Actually, we expect manufacturing, the industry, to outgrow the kind of average UK economy, which we think will grow about 7.5% in 2021. So it's really, really robust, and we're really happy about these results, and we hope that the manufacturing community should also feel quite positive about what they have seen in the last 3 months.
It's certainly been well received when we reported them. And so is it fair to say that we are experiencing a V-shaped recovery, or is it too early to say that?
If you were to look at the numbers and were to plot them on a line graph and you're looking at the growth rates, it does actually appear to be a V-shaped recovery. That being said, there's going to be a lot of sectoral differences within manufacturing. The V-shaped recovery will be for sectors that tend to be more resilient during a crisis, like food and drink. We know certainly that the pharmaceutical industry did not see a massive collapse during the pandemic. But then there are industries like aerospace, which are actually still struggling, and actually is one of the only four industries that we still forecast will probably still decline as long as air travel restrictions persist. So that sector is just not going to recover. So there's going to be differences there, but on average, it does appear to be V-like shape recovery.
It's fascinating. Thank you very much for that. And it all sounds pretty positive. But if you were to look at this report, I think you just alluded to it slightly, but if you were to look at the 2019 report for this quarter, how far away are we behind that?
So actually, 2019 was a peculiar year, of course, as well, because the sector was also still facing a massive amounts of uncertainty due to the Brexit negotiations that we had between the UK and the EU. At the moment, we see that the sector is still about 18 billion pounds behind where it was pre-pandemic, which is about where it ended at Q4 2019. And to compare this more directly from 12 months on, so given that we're in Q2, and if we look at this from Q2 2020, which is when exactly the pandemic roughly started, certainly the widespread of declines that our survey reported in that quarter, which is exactly 12 months ago, are much more severe than the improvement in output and orders we have seen in this quarter. So on balance, currently the downs do outweigh the ups. So there's still some catching up to do in that sector.
And when do you anticipate the £18 billion actually being recovered, or to get back to where we were really? How long will that take, do you think?
Yeah, so we have done some work on making those sort of forecasts. We have made a few assumptions, which I think are worth mentioning. That we are assuming that the vaccination strategy is going to be pretty successful and is going to enable the society to essentially return to something as close to normal as possible, and that they were not going to go back to the level of restrictions that we had during the peak of the pandemic. Our forecasts do indicate that sometime by the end of 2022, the manufacturing sector, by billions of pounds of gross value added, will go back to where it was in 2019. And that's roughly 6 to 12 months sooner than our previous forecast suggested, when we were expecting a much slower recovery. Just to put that in hindsight of other crises in the past, like let's say the global financial crisis, this is a very optimistic forecast. I don't know if you guys have ever looked at the numbers for the global financial crisis and how that affected manufacturing, but that also wiped out approximately a very similar amount of gross value added from the manufacturing sector. And that actually took almost 10 years to recover, just because the type of the crisis was so different. Whereas in this case, the crisis is not necessarily that manufacturers and businesses and households don't want to spend money or they don't want to invest. It's just that they were unable to, or they were artificially held back from doing that. And because that the shackles have been mostly unleashed, we do expect that the forecast, or at least our current forecast, assumes that we could get back to in 2022. That is an upside. Again, I would caution there is also possibilities that things can go wrong with new variants. Let's say potential returns to strict lockdowns. If you were to account for these type of issues, then it could take a lot longer than that year. But we're pretty optimistic with the forecast at the moment.
And you mentioned aerospace. We talk with a lot of people. We visit a lot of companies. And aerospace, clearly, they're having challenging times at the moment. Are there any other sectors that haven't bounced back? I'm thinking automotive. I know we've got the supply chain issues currently, but they remain strong.
Yeah, actually, automotives had one of the most severe declines in 2020 that we recorded. And actually, we do our forecast to indicate that they are going to experience a significant bounce back in output. Just because demand is so high for vehicles at the moment, and not just, personal vehicles, which I think the secondhand car market is also currently booming because of that, but also just sort of business travels, vehicles, heavy goods vehicles, that sort of thing. The only issues that the automotive sector does currently face is a more supply side. There are shortages of certain components, particularly electrical components from the electronics sector. It is not clear from our side where those supply side issues are originating from, but from what we understand is to do mainly with semiconductors and potential chips. But again, it's not necessarily clear whether that's chip manufacturers or it's actually the kind of the raw material, the miners for copper and zinc and those sort of elements that are struggling to fill that supply.
Sure, and just on the aerospace sector, I read lots of reports and sound bites from stakeholders from within that sector, and some people are talking about 2030, 2035 before it makes a full recovery. Is that something you're predicting, or you've been a bit more optimistic?
We don't have a full prediction on when it's going to recover, but we do tend to get very similar reports from our members in aerospace. The way they see it, the story is very different from what the Q2 and manufacturing outlook has reported. In many cases, firms like in that industry in aviation were down from like 80 to 100% of their usual output levels, and maybe 12 months on that they're now currently down by only 70 or 60%. So they're just in a slightly better place than they were, but they still have a very long way to go. And the only restrictions to that is as long as there are travel restrictions, as long as there are anything that impacts the supply chains of aerospace or even the oil and gas industry, where oil prices are also rising right now, then that is going to hold back the aerospace industry. If we want to think about it slightly more stretched about whether or not how easy it is for this sector to come back, it is very difficult, particularly from airports reopening. So there's a difference between opening an airport like Heathrow in the UK, which can generate quite a lot of income because it has a lot of business, it has a lot of activity, as opposed to reopening airports that are in the north of England or in other town areas, which tend to run on very high marginal costs. So there could be issues there where actually even when the demand for flight does come back, that it may not necessarily be that easy for airports around the world to deliver on locations and destinations. And it's only going to be these sort of major city airports that are be able to open very quickly just because of the demand that they can attract. So there are going to be issues there. And it is probably the only sector that we're still concerned about.
That makes sense. And in the shorter term, what are manufacturers telling us about quarter three? How confident are they?
Yeah. So here's I think something interesting is quite worth mentioning just before I go into that. We can plot the forecasts that manufacturers have made on a quarterly basis historically and match that to what the actual outcome was in our quarterly survey. And historically, manufacturers are actually really good at predicting what the next quarter is going to look like. And they should be. It's their business. And if you don't know what's happening in the next 3 months, then that's a problem. The only thing that we have seen slightly change is that since the pandemic started and the economic environment became super uncertain, predictions from manufacturers became largely more erratic and inconsistent. In most cases, when they were expecting this economy to decline, they actually outdone their expectations and it declined more than they expected it to. And when they expected the growth to occur, that again, manufacturers outdid their own expectations and it grew more than twice as much as they expected. So for this quarter, I think the current level of output was actually like twice as much as what manufacturers predicted. And they do expect for the next 3 months that all of our indicators, so that is output, orders, employment, and even investment, is expected to expand much further. So we're looking to break the current records again in the next quarter. But given how uncertain the environment has been, it is difficult to say how right they're going to be at this current situation. But so far, they've been right in a good way. So when they expect things to be good, it's been better than good. So if we can keep that going, then we should be pretty confident about the future.
Yeah, again, fascinating stuff. Just the final one for me. How's employment looking? Obviously, we're talking a lot about STEM and apprenticeships at the moment, but just in employment as a whole, how's that been the last quarter?
Another one of our very positive figures. It wasn't record breaking by any means, but we got an employment balance of 20%. So a positive 20%, meaning that on balance, 20% of manufacturers more saw an increase in employment levels than those that saw a decrease in employment levels. And that is despite the JRS being active. What that indicates to us is that because of the sharp rise in demand, manufacturers do need workers again to fulfill those workloads. What we are finding is that there is an issue with labor shortages in many industries, particularly in the kind of high skill areas. Manufacturers or our members have indicated to us that they are having to sharply raise wages now in order to keep their best and brightest talent. It's difficult to say what is the cause of that labor shortage. It's probably a mixture of people potentially still on furlough and don't necessarily want to come back to work yet, or at least the offer of not working is probably better than actually working. But then there's also an issue of maybe the manufacturing sector was somewhat reliant on EU workers, and many of those have actually left the UK. So we're positive that there is a demand for labor. We're quite concerned about the shortages of labor and how that is going to impact wages. If wages rise, that's of course good for people. But if that does filter into the price of products and goods, then that actually can end up being a fairly negative issue in the long run if inflation goes up.
Yeah, fascinating stuff, Fhaheen. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today and giving our listeners an insight to the report. Where's the best place to find this report if they want to learn more?
It's the website. The report is publicly available on our website. It is pretty easy to download right now. I would also just sort of add as a kind of, I suppose, a little preview is that we are also currently looking at the kind of the regional perspective of this quarterly survey. So we look at the data of the last 12 months and how that actually compares to regions, and that's going to be out next month. So I would keep an eye out for that as well. Thank you.
Brilliant. Fhaheen, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been fantastic, and we'll see you soon.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Stuart, what a fantastic guest. It's just great to dive into the details of the numbers of these reports, isn't it?
Absolutely. With the output, new jobs being created, the confidence in the sector, not just now, but for in the near future as well. And very confident the aerospace sector will recover in due course as well.
Yeah, if you want to feature on this podcast, please do reach out to us, podcast@mtdmfg.com. It would be great to feature you, whether you're large manufacturer, a global blue chip, but good old SME as well. We want to cover everyone on this show. And also please do download the MTD MFG app. It's in all the usual app stores, and please download it to get exclusive content. But we'll get back on the news. French-owned Efinor, they're expanding their footprint in the UK.
Yes, they are. Inward investment news, which is always very welcome, always very popular on the MTD and Jefferson platform. Southwest of England nuclear sector has received a major boost with international engineering manufacturing and support company Efinor opening a new technology centre in the Bristol area. Nuclear Southwest, the organisation which champions the region, has welcomed the expansion, creation of 60 highly skilled jobs, which they say demonstrates the strength and resilience of the region's nuclear sector. The firm's new manufacturing and technology centre in Avonmouth near Bristol will support the construction of the Hinkley Point C nuclear power plant in Somerset.
Speaking of new factories, BioPure Technology, what do you know about this one?
Work is underway constructing a new 120,000 square foot production facility for them. They manufacture fluid path components for the biotechnology industry. Don't ask me to explain what that means. Located at the Portsmouth City Council-owned Dunsbury Park, the investment is expected to create 120 jobs, which I do understand. BioPure is part of the Watson-Marlow Fluid Technology Group, a wholly owned subsidiary of Spirex Sarco, a global organisation employing around about 4,800 people worldwide.
Yeah, guess what's next? Another new facility, this time IDMH, set to create 200 jobs in Sheffield.
Yeah, we've seen quite a few new facilities and factories in this sector. So modular house manufacturer IDMH has established a new base in South Yorkshire to support its expansion. The firm already has a 50,000 square foot facility in Liverpool where it employs around about 70 people, whereas the new site is 3 times the size. I think it's over 200,000 square feet. 35 people are currently employed in Sheffield, and the firm expects this to rise to 80 over the next few months, with the workforce set to reach 200 in the next year.
This next story, this got a lot of traction on social media. A lot of it's down to some nice imagery and what have you, but Vertical Aerospace secures flying taxis orders from Virgin and American Airlines. Good news.
It certainly is a great story, and this company has really worked hard over the last 5-6 years to develop this. So Bristol's Vertical Aerospace has announced 1,000 pre-orders for its all-electric flying taxis after confirming it will become publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange. The aerospace firm, which was founded in 2016 to develop the world's first all-electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, has received pre-orders from Dublin-based Avalon, American Airlines, and a pre-order option from Virgin Atlantic worth £4 billion, and has also secured investment from Microsoft, Honeywell, Rolls-Royce, and others. According to the firm, which unveiled its designs last year, we reported on it, the vehicle will be able to carry 4 passengers for 120 miles at speeds at more than 200 miles an hour. So better than an Uber.
Yeah, it's just like the movies, isn't it? I can't think of one off the top of my head, but back in the day, you'd look at these movies and you'd think, crikey, that's never going to happen, but it looks like it is.
Yeah, it certainly does, Joe.
And the final one today, the government, they were reportedly in talks with up to 6 companies about new gigafactories. We talk about gigafactories most weeks here on the show, and this week's no different.
Absolutely. So this broke in the last few minutes, really. So Britain is reportedly in talks with 6 companies for building gigafactories, as you say, to produce factories. And credit to the Financial Times, they were the first to report this, citing people briefed on the discussions. Companies in question are Ford, Nissan, LG, Samsung, and startups British Volt and Innobat Auto. They're in contact with the government and local authorities about locations and also funding for potential factories across the UK. Just to give you a bit of context, so far there are 38 planned gigafactories across Europe, according to Green Lobby Group Transport and Environment, with only Britishvolt's project being disclosed in the UK. In early stage talks with the British government, Ford has indicated it was exploring making batteries in the UK that would be shipped to Turkey for use in a planned electric version of its transport van, which we covered in a previous podcast.
Yeah, well, let's hope at least some of these come off because we need them. So fingers crossed they all come off, of course.
Absolutely. Yeah, we can't be too greedy, but yeah, it'd be great to have 6, but 2 or 3 would be fantastic.
That brings this week's podcast to a close. Thank you, as always. There's more news on our website. We don't get a chance to cover everything on this podcast. Please follow us on social media at MTDMFG and at Jefferson_MFG. Thanks to Stuart. Thanks to Make UK for joining us on this week's podcast. But most importantly, the biggest thank you, as always, goes to you at home for listening. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening to the Great British Manufacturing Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating and a review. You can find us on Twitter using @MTDMFG and @Jefferson_MFG.